Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you to everyone for joining today's Transcelerate webinar on risk-based monitoring and how risk-based monitoring can support sites with central monitoring. Today's panel will include representatives from sites, from CROs, as well as from sponsor companies. My name is Gloria McHugh. I work for Transcelerate as Webinar Operations and Project Manager. And I'd like to first make some introductions before we get started. Joining us today for our panel discussion, Marion Wolfs joins us from the risk-based monitoring area of Johnson & Johnson. She'll be our moderator for today. Also joining us are Melissa Poindexter, President of Advances in Health, an independent clinical research site, and Jennifer Hebert, Associate Director in Data-Driven Monitoring for Parexel International, as well as Jeanne Young, who is on assignment to Transcelerate from Sanofi. Transcelerate program directors help manage all of the programs within Transcelerate, and Jeanne will help with some of the questions and answers as we continue our panel discussion. So the format for today's meeting will be that we cover a few logistics to make sure that all of the technology is working. Marion Wolfs will provide a short overview of risk-based monitoring, Transcelerate's methodology, and its impact to sites and sponsors. And then we'll get into our panel discussion, leaving most of the hour today for the panel discussion. And then at the end, we'll take as many questions as we can. So firstly, let's cover some of the logistics for today's webinar. Everyone is muted for the call. For audio, you should be able to connect by either your computer or your phone. And you should see a control panel from GoToWebinar on your screen. You can reduce that control panel for a better view of the presentation using the white and orange arrow in the upper right. If you'd like to submit a question to the presenters during the panel discussion, please type your question into the questions section of your control panel and click send. If you have any other feedback to report or technical issues, please send an email to events@transceleratebiopharmainc.com. So we also have a couple of polling questions for our audience today to help make the session interactive and facilitate sharing of information. Please note that all of your participation is voluntary and all responses will be anonymous. Answers will only be shared as a percentage of the respondents who responded. So just to make sure that all of the technology is working, and to make sure that everyone can hear me as well, I'm going to go ahead and launch our first poll. What is your favorite color? So please go ahead and select your favorite color in the poll on the screen, and we'll go ahead and share those responses when we have a number of participants who have voted. So thank you to those who have voted. We've got about 70% of the folks on the line have voted already, up to 80%. Thank you very much. All right, I'm going to close the poll in the interest of time. And you can see that 56% of the people on the phone said that blue is their favorite color, 20% said red, 13% said orange, and 11% said pink. So thank you very much for participating, and it sounds like the technology is working and that we can continue with our webinar. So for all of Transcelerate's webinars, we always like to make sure that everyone understands our ground rules. We want to make sure that the discussion is helpful, but we do have some limitations on the type of information that we can share. So again, participation in all of our webinars is voluntary. Any of the poll questions is voluntary, and using any Transcelerate asset or tool is also voluntary. Particular things we ask you not to discuss here today is any vendors, sites, or CROs that you are using or not using, any sponsors that you're working with, or any issues or problems that you have with specific vendors, sites, CROs, or sponsors. Please don't share any long-term development plans or anything related to costs. All right, so before we get started, we have a second poll as well. So we'd like to know what type of company are you representing? Are you here representing sites? Are you representing sponsor company? Or are you representing a CRO company? I'll leave that poll open for a few seconds. We've got about 75% of the folks on the phone have voted so far, so thank you very much. Up to about 84% of the folks on the phone have responded, so thank you. And again, in the interest of time, I'll go ahead and close that, and I'll share the results. And so you can see that the majority of the folks on the phone today, 69% are representing sponsor companies, 17% are representing sites, and 14% are representing CROs. So again, thank you for participating. It gives our panel a good idea of who our audience is today. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Marion Wolfs. Again, Marion is with Janssen, the pharmaceutical division of J&J, and Marion will walk us through a high-level overview of the Transcelerate risk-based monitoring. Marion?
Thank you, Gloria, for this nice introduction, and welcome again, everyone, to this webinar. Before we dive into the detail, the actual topic of the webinar, how central monitoring can support sites, I would like to give you a short historical overview of the Transcelerate risk-based monitoring journey. So the risk-based monitoring initiative was established in 2012 as one of Transcelerate's 5 initial projects, and it was designed to create efficient and effective solutions in the pharmaceutical industry. As you might know, trials were becoming more and more complex. Sites may have varying levels of experience, but the conventional monitoring approaches were not designed to manage potential differences appropriately. So there was a need to change. And although regulators were urging companies to move to a risk-based approach, no well-understood methodology existed that would have enabled the organizations to successfully deploy and scale risk-based monitoring. So to enable the industry to do so, over the years, Transcelerate has developed model guidelines and tools for targeted risk-based monitoring. And I want to emphasize here that although Transcelerate has developed a high-level process for risk-based monitoring and guidance and tool, it was never the intent, or it is not the intent, that it's mandatory to implement. So all companies can implement as they wish and practically implement it according to their needs and how it fits best within their organization. Now, more and more companies are implementing risk-based monitoring. The risk-based monitoring initiative is in realization mode, and the emphasis of the work is now less on developing new and additional guidance, but more on providing support and sharing experiences with risk-based implementation, as we do today during this webinar. Next slide, please. So what is analytical risk-based monitoring? I assume, and I think the vast majority of the audience, the people that are on the call, have some knowledge about ARBM, about analytical risk-based monitoring. I think it is important to re-emphasize and to make sure that we are all on the same page and have a good understanding of what we are talking about. And for me, the definition that you see on the slide here, on the top of the slide, really touches upon all the aspects of risk-based monitoring. Risk-based monitoring is an adaptive approach to clinical trial monitoring that directs monitoring focus and activities to the evolving areas of greatest need, which have the most impact, most potential to impact patient safety and data quality. It really captures it all. With that, ARBM can increase the quality by focusing on subject safety and critical data and reducing the errors that matter. It helps study teams to maintain trial oversight throughout ongoing and continuous review of information, trends, and metrics. And by building quality and risk management approaches into the scientific design and operational conduct of our clinical trials, risks can be mitigated and issues can be detected early on or prevented entirely. Although on-site monitoring practices do provide a level of control and are still absolutely necessary, advances in risk-based approaches and technology provide an opportunity for a more holistic and proactive approach. And through modernization, including the technology enablers, efficiencies can be gained without impacting subject safety and data quality. For me, this is an important point because one of the reasons the health authorities requested the industry to move towards risk-based monitoring approaches was because medications were becoming too expensive and clinical trials were becoming too burdensome. With these efficiencies, the intent is to get medication to the patients quicker and less expensive. Next slide, please, Gloria. Risk-based monitoring is a comprehensive approach to monitoring, and it should be fit for purpose for a particular trial and based on a proper risk assessment. The risk-based monitoring strategy consists of 3 layers of monitoring that are complementary of each other. You can see it here on the slide. So you have in the blue all the on-site monitoring activities. This is really all the assessments and activities that will need to be done on-site. Then the off-site or remote monitoring activities. These are meant to help facilitate, sites with resolving issues and provide tailored support. And then the more overarching holistic central monitoring. This includes medical review, data management review, safety review, statistical review. And if you can go to the next slide, Gloria, I can speak to that in a little bit more detail. The focus of this webinar, as mentioned, is on how central monitoring can support our sites. And in this slide and the next 2 slides, I will speak to that in a little bit more detail on how the two are linked together. So the central monitoring, with central monitoring, we use analytics to analyze the data as real-time as possible to identify trends and outliers. This helps us with early decision-making, but also being able to identify the level of support a particular site might need, and it helps us trigger to know when the CRA would need to go to a site or need to connect with the site for an off-site monitoring activities. Next slide, please. And here you can see how that is linked together. So together with the outputs that we get from central monitoring, together with the study complexity, the experience for the different sites, the number of patients enrolled, tasks that must be performed on sites that can be quite different, one trial compared to another, that all is taken into account when we determine the best appropriate time for the CRO to go to a site. And this should help with avoiding CROs not having sufficient time to get the work done when they are at the site, or at the other hand, go to a site when there's not enough work to do so, when it's not really necessary. So instead of what we should do according to a traditional model, we now have central monitoring help dictate the on-site monitoring activities instead of having a fixed time interval. And if central monitoring works well, the sites should have better experience. They should experience better tailored support and have more meaningful conversations with the CRAs, and then more well-rounded monitoring during the study. And now we have talked about Trancelerate, what risk-based monitoring is, the different components of the monitoring in a little bit more detail, I would like to hand it over to Melissa Poindexter, President of Advances in Health, a member of the Associative for Clinical Trial Research Sites, to talk about a case study of central monitoring. Melissa, I would like to hand over to you.
Yes, thank you, Gloria. So as we go over the case study, imagine that you have a team of medically trained data reviewers assigned to a group of subjects throughout the course of a subject's participation. So in this case study, we have Abby Brown, who is participating in a menopausal study of an oral investigational drug. A reviewer is analyzing her visit 6 information that has been posted in EDC by the coordinator. Also, the reviewer is reviewing the lab results transmitted by the central lab. While reviewing the subject's vital signs, the centralized reviewer notices a slight increase in Abby Brown's blood pressure since the last visit, and also a gradual increase at each visit since baseline. They also note that her liver enzymes are elevated. So while reviewing the data of the other subjects assigned to the central monitor, they note that the elevations are not unique to Abby Brown, but across the board for many other subjects. The central monitor then flags the data and sends an alert to the project manager. As a result of the alert, the project manager then reviews similar data for all study participants, specifically lab, AEs, and blood pressure, and confirms there's a trend. So after this, the medical team is notified of a possible global trend and analyzes the data. The medical team then decides to amend the protocol to include safety liver enzymes at each visit and to drop subjects whose blood pressures are greater than 160/90. In addition, the team also decides to add blood pressures and liver enzymes as key data points to be verified at 100% for all subjects. So previously with traditional monitoring, it would have taken months to reveal the safety issues. Project managers would have had to rely on monitoring reports for their information, and those reports are submitted after the monthly on-site visits. So the implementation of centralized monitoring and technology has allowed for faster informed decisions, making improving subject safety.
Okay, so we can now then start with the panel discussion. And if you can go to the next slide, Gloria, we can start with the first question. And I want to introduce this question a little bit before I hand it over to Jennifer Hebert, the Associate Director at Parexel. According to the Transcelerate surveys, we hear that member companies have improved their on-site activities and focused the site activities according to their satisfaction by developing strategic approaches, and they have improved in quality. And potential issues were identified real-time, evaluated, and mitigated. This sounds all very good, well. So from a sponsor perspective, we can say that central monitoring is working well. But I would like to ask Jennifer, can you explain, in your opinion, how sites can benefit from central monitoring and study activities different than traditional performances measurements?
Thanks, Marian. Certainly. The nature of RBM itself lends us to have a closer relationship, I think, between the site and the CRO, because the focus is really starting to shift away from the traditional after-the-fact corrections to non-compliance monitoring to more of a preventative, quality-focused approach. So our intent has really shifted towards the identification of risk and trends, outliers in the data that we can find early enough to prevent longer-term, larger issues that could impact data quality or patient safety. So really, our interactions are going to be targeting the promotion of data quality, patient safety, and the queries and site contacts are going to be aligned with those priorities. So we're trying to really move away and eliminate a lot of focus and queries on non-critical data that could have been very time-consuming for the site to have to resolve. So this should align priorities between the monitor and the site pretty nicely. We also will hopefully see more real-time site support through our central monitoring technology. So although we are looking now at a maximum interval between 2 on-site monitoring visits, monitors should be more available to assist sites in between. So they should be getting more timely answers when they have questions, and they won't have to wait until the next on-site visit. There should be more of an open line of communication, and so hopefully we'll foster a better relationship between the monitors and the study coordinators, and maybe it will be through a single point of contact, or there might be an off-site monitor who is also having a relationship with the site and is available for them. But basically, really enabling the site to help participate in the early identification of risks that might arise and data quality issues. And, really utilizing things like workload to make sure that when the CRA does come on site, that they have a very focused and directed visit, and that the site can remain inspection ready, but it should make more sense overall in terms of how the visit happens and really utilizes time for the benefit of everybody.
And Jennifer, I know you have had 2 slides to kind of emphasize the things that you have explained so far. So Gloria, can you please move to the next slide?
There we go.
Is there anything that you can add that you have already mentioned, or do you want us to move to the next slide already?
The only thing I'll mention while we're on this slide is that there are technologies available that can help with this and really continue to develop that relationship. So we can see a little bit of a screenshot to the left. It's just one of many different things. But as we see the focus shift for risk-based monitoring, we're really empowered by technology and process to bring these benefits to sites. So we can go to the next slide. So building on that just a little bit, we can talk about the fact that overall, with an RBM approach study, the sites are being asked to enter data within a shorter time frame of the patient visit, irrespective of when the next on-site monitoring visit is scheduled. But by doing this, the upside is really that the data becomes available to central or medical reviewers. And that transparency can allow for the identification of issues like you can see here. So this is one of many tools that could be used. That this one in particular just maps the timing of serious adverse events across the study, the day of study. So what you can see here is some clustering that is happening for a particular type of adverse event, and that's happening right around the time of dosing. So the entry of this information in closer to real time is enabling the medical monitors or the central monitors to highlight these sorts of trends and give that feedback back through the clinical team and also alert the site. So this can really help to surface some of these sorts of trends that would not have been available without these visualizations.
Thank you, Jennifer. And I think, Melissa, this kind of adds nicely to the case study that you have, that you already presented. So could you share a bit more your thoughts from a site perspective to this?
Yeah, what I would like to add is, as a site, if you have 40 patients in a study, and they're all going through the visits about the same pace, it's easy to overlook elevated lab work or things that stand out. And it's often also easy, you have your inclusion exclusion criteria, which you really need to refer to throughout the course of the study. So an example where, for instance, you have elevated liver enzymes, you may not catch it if you're looking at the lab reports. You may not catch it, I'll say, for several days or maybe a week. So with centralized monitoring, as Jennifer noted here, they have graphs, and the data just pops out. And to get the alerts as quickly as we can to take subjects off medications is really an advantage.
Thank you, Melissa. And then I think I would like to stay with you for the next question. That's the question 2. So if you can move to the next slide. Yes. So are sites getting the support, right? We see some examples of output, and you've shared the case study, but would you able to give an example of what type of support you're getting from central monitoring?
Well, yes, we are getting the support. I know often I hear other sites is commenting on the excessive calls they get, but it's really a result of centralized monitoring. There's more eyes looking at the data. Something as simple as your subject has met the criteria and they're ready to be randomized is helpful as trials become more complex and the inclusion and exclusion criteria is more complex. It's nice to know that several people have reviewed the criteria and you know that your patient is ready to be randomized. Something that simple is helpful.
Thank you. And then, Melissa, would you be able to add to this from a CRO perspective?
Sure. So I think we still have a long way to go, but we've been pretty successful at starting to share some of what we can see from a technology perspective. When we go to the site, we can share, for example, we saw that other particular visualization. We can take screenshots, we can share that with sites to show them exactly what we're seeing, and I think that's helpful. But in terms of whether or not they're really getting that support from the technology, I do think that we have opportunities to improve in that regard, making technology more objective so that it can give them an idea when they log in. I know that there's dashboards coming available, but give them an idea when they log in if there's anything that is falling out of range, so that they can see what the central monitors are seeing. They can better understand where the priorities are and prepare themselves for any upcoming visits or any site contacts that might be coming.
Okay, and I think then next would be a polling question, if I recall correctly. Yes. So I hand it over to you, Gloria, for this one.
Great, thank you. So we do have another polling question for our audience. So if you could please respond to the poll. The question is, from your perspective, do you believe that central monitoring technology is currently meeting your needs? And so the selections would be yes, it is currently meeting your needs, somewhat, but the technology could still be improved, or no, it is really not meeting my needs. So we'll wait a few seconds to allow everyone to vote. So thank you very much. So far we've got about 50% of the folks on the phone have voted. A few more seconds. Right, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. We've got about 70% of the folks on the phone voted for that poll, so thank you. So it looks like a clear majority feels 65% of the folks that voted feel that somewhat, but that the technology could still be improved. 19% said yes, it is currently meeting their needs, and 16% said no, it is not meeting their needs. So thanks to everyone for that insight. I think that seems like what we've heard from our panel discussions as well. Back to you, Marion.
Yes, thank you so much. So for our next question, what we know from our Transcelerate surveys is that, we know that the sponsor companies have made updates to their processes and systems. And we also have done surveys about how satisfied the sites are, and that feedback remains consistent and mostly positive. Also from these surveys, it seems that the sites are satisfied with the communication from sponsors, with the on-site visit frequency, but that they are not largely or not yet made changes to their processes and systems as a result of risk-based monitoring. And Jennifer, from a CRO perspective, would you be able to address or speak to this question?
I certainly can. In terms of our feedback that we get sometimes from sites, we do see that where there have been trials where SDV has been reduced and the site may not be comfortable with the level of SDV, sometimes they'll change their processes at the site to pick up some of the SDV burden. We've had sites even say that they are now doing 100% SDV because the monitor is not doing it. So what we're seeing sometimes is that they're picking up the workload from the monitor. And of course, the main concern often when RBM first started to come out, and still remains a concern for many sites, is that they will have less support and more workload. And of course, we don't want to see that. So that is something that we definitely have had come up in terms of process changes.
Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, go ahead. Yes. Melissa, from a site perspective, can you share some of your experience with regards to this?
Yes. So what we have done, we've implemented a potential, I'll say, risk-based approach to running the trials, mainly to prevent deviations. So at the site initiation visits, we'll ask the monitors to share with us where they see potential deviations to the protocol, or also to share their safety concerns. So with that information, then we'll develop a checklist specific for each visit's procedures, and we'll have asterisks if there's unique requirements to do a particular procedure. We'll have this information on the checklist, and this is printed for every subject for every visit. So the coordinator, in a sense, it's sort of a goof-proof checklist. So they have everything at their fingertips. So nothing will be missed, and all procedures will be done per protocol.
Thanks, Melissa. And with that, I would like to move to the last panel question that we have today. And that's about the broad range of approaches that exist in risk-based monitoring implementation across the industry. I touched upon it at the beginning of the webinar already, that although Transcelerate provides tools and guidance, it's not mandatory for sponsors or CRO companies to implement, and also not mandatory on how they implement it. So there is a variation, there is a difference in how different companies are doing this. So how could this affect the way that sites perceive the benefits from risk-based monitoring? And I would like to address the question to both Melissa and Jennifer. Melissa, Can I ask you to talk to this first?
Yes. As I talk to other sites, the general message I get is they feel as though there's little communication internally between the in-house monitor, data management, safety, and the on-site monitor. And they all end up duplicating requests for the same information. And I think Jennifer addressed this, but I think it's especially overwhelming. We are a dedicated research site, so we don't have private practice patients, but I think for a nurse in a private practice setting who also has to attend to her private patients may find the duplication of requests and calls overwhelming.
I can definitely see how that would be true, and I think there are definitely some best practices that we have found in terms of who reaches out to a site and how the internal CRO and sponsor staff are communicating to minimize some of the replication of requests for information to a site. And I think in general, the range of approaches and even the difference between definitions can be really challenging for sites, because even down to something as what we would consider as simple as SDV versus SDR, there's a range of definitions. There's a range of definitions when we talk about remote versus off-site monitoring, and frequently you'll hear sites express frustration when they hear the word remote remote monitoring, because they immediately think of hundreds and hundreds of pages of patient records that now need to be redacted and faxed. So I do think that the benefits of risk-based monitoring sometimes are not recognized or are blunted by the fact that there are different approaches, and that some approaches are still in their infancy in terms of development, and then some approaches have had enough time to mature and really figure out some of the best practices. So I think that we'll continue to see growth in that area as technology and process move forward.
Absolutely, and I think the one thing that I would like to add here is that webinars like these and communicating with each other, so sponsors, CROs, sites, that's key to continuous improvement to the risk-based monitoring processes. Gloria, I think this was the last panel question that we've had, so we have about 20 minutes to look at any questions that we have received so far.
That's correct, Marion. Thank you, everyone. Jeanne Spasaro she's been monitoring the questions, and it looks like we do have a number of questions that have been submitted from our audience. So Jeanne's going to read those out and ask the panelists to weigh in on their thoughts on those questions. Jeanne?
Yes, thanks everyone. Thanks to all the presenters and the panelists. Really fantastic job. What I am going to do is I'm going to look at the questions that we've received live today, but we've also received a number of questions that we've reviewed in advance of the actual webinar when you registered. So we've had an opportunity to look at those as we prepared for today's webinar. So we want to be really precise in how we provide those answers. So it'll be a combination of both. So if you don't see your specific question coming forward, you will, if you listen carefully, you'll probably hear it incorporated to a more broadly focused question. So I'm hearing, and what I'm seeing and reading over and over again is, really, and I think the whole intent of the webinar was to look at the impact of risk-based monitoring on sites. And from the panel's perspective, when talking about centralized monitoring and the issues and signals and the way we communicate with the sites, how we communicate the level of risk and awareness, how are the inputs that we now have, or the outputs that we now have coming out of centralized monitoring shared with your sites? Because this may be occurring in a variety of different ways. So Jennifer, Melissa, perhaps you could provide some perspective there on how the outputs are getting to the sites specifically.
So this is Jennifer. So from a CRO perspective, this has changed, I think, a little bit in industry. I can speak to kind of the main models and the one that we use. So the two main models that I see are, one is you have a centralized monitor who is reviewing these sorts of reports or analytics, or sometimes just collated stats reports, and then they are reaching out directly to the site. That's one model. And then the second model, and the model that I'm more familiar with because it's the one that we use, is we have a central monitor who does their review of the analytics and brings those observations to an internal CRO team meeting where the observations are shared with the medical monitor, the clinical lead, the data management lead, and the project lead. And those people assign a significance. So they decide, if an observation is really an issue. And then if it is, they will decide what is the mitigation strategy going to be. So how big of a risk and what steps should we take? And sometimes if the risk is not deemed to be too significant, it might be something that is just noted and it's going to be observed. And there might be no communication to the site at that point. And then if it is something where it's felt that the site needs to be made aware, that will then be channeled through the clinical lead back to the CRA, who actually speaks directly with the site. So we follow a little bit of a different structure. But I think either way works as long as the person that is communicating with the site isn't issuing a lot of duplicate requests and has a relationship with the site. And if you want to build on that at all, Melissa.
Yeah, well, you covered it very well. The only thing I can add to that as a site is if there is an in-house monitor, which I guess can also be an off-site monitor. When you talk about definitions, we use in-house, but they're also off-site. We get most of our communication from them, and most of those in-house monitors keep in contact with the sites, maybe every 2 weeks. We like that because there's a constant flow of communication and follow-up. However, not the discussions or the things that come up in those calls aren't always, I guess, of concern to the monitor, the on-site monitor. But we have found that to be the best form of communication if there's safety issues or trends that come up. The other way that we receive information sometimes is just through an email or administrative letter. Sometimes the newsletters will address situations. However, we feel the conversation with the in-house monitor is best because information can be overlooked in a newsletter, and there's always questions if we receive something through an email. So we prefer having a conversation with a representative from the sponsor, the CRO.
This is Marion. I think from a sponsor perspective, the only thing that I think is really important is the ongoing feedback from central monitoring, in which format that is. There are different ways that I think would work. I think the real advantage for sites and for the whole industry, if you will, from central monitoring is the fact that you would review the data real time on a continuous basis. So you would no longer end up in a situation that for, let's say, an oncology trials that goes on for 5 or more years, that when the time database lock is approaching, the site is bombarded with a lot of queries that go back to data that's entered 2 years ago, and then they have to look back in source data trying to find the answers to these questions. It would be much more in the now, in trying to get resolutions to things that need to be resolved, and again, provide the support at the appropriate time.
Okay, thank you. Again, any other further responses, or I'll move on to what I think is a probably common thread that I'm seeing here. So we focused a lot. There are a number of questions regarding vendors, specific vendors, preferences, and as we had indicated earlier on, we will not be discussing the preference for or use of any particular vendor. Regarding the analytics that come out of the systems, there's a number of questions that point to the question of how do we identify those critical data points? When are we identifying them? In what stage of the process when you're developing the protocol are you identifying your critical data points, and is that being communicated with the sites, before their initial site visitation, the site initiation visit? So I'm hearing a mix of, we understand that we need to be able to assess the critical data points, but what does that impact when there may be a number of those identified earlier on in the trial? So focusing on protocol development, when do we communicate those critical data points, and what's the impact on the sites in terms of communicating that up front?
Yeah, so Jeanne, I can speak to that with my Janssen head up. This is Marion Wolf talking. So what we would do at Janssen is before we have the final protocol, we would already start the protocol assessment process, where we would identify what we would consider critical to the quality for that protocol, and we would look into see how is it possible to make changes to the protocol to avoid certain risks or make more clarity in the protocol, really to get to quality by design principle embedded into the protocol development process. Then after that, we would continue the risk assessment after finalization of the protocol, because as you can imagine, a lot of the risks or critical to quality factors are linked to the operationalization of the protocol, if you will. We would do that assessment, and we would finalize that assessment before we have the first patient in the study. We would document that in a central place, so everyone knows what to do and how we will monitor and mitigate it. And yes, and I think I saw that to one of the questions that will be shared during investigator meeting and site initiation visit meeting. So also our sites know what critical to quality means for that particular protocol. So also the sites can focus on these most critical things within that clinical trial.
Okay. Any other thoughts from the rest of the panelists on that? Okay, another really broad topic, and I think, if we look at all the questions collectively, from your perspective on the panel, what do you feel is the overall site perception of risk-based monitoring and how it impacts them? And this, I'm sure, could be quite different depending on their personal experiences, but. Any thoughts? Overall?
Yeah, no, I do. So now with my Transcelerate hat on, I know from the surveys, sites seem to provide us with, being satisfied and being okay with the level of communication in general, and also with the new monitoring frequency more tailored to the specific needs of that trial. So from that perspective, that looks okay. With my Janssen head up, again, we surveyed our sites, and I think in general, the vast majority of our sites are satisfied with the way we have rolled out our risk-based monitoring processes. Is there room for improvement to help sites better to make sure that they get more out of the central monitoring? Yes, I absolutely think so. And again, maybe there are sites that have different experiences, and maybe sometimes it's also depending on yeah, which experience you have. So Jennifer, Melissa, is there anything that you can add from CRO site perspective to this as well?
This is Melissa. I think at the site level, because so many sites are working with various sponsors, small sponsors, big pharma, it's not all the same. So I think what we need to realize as a site is this is something new, and there are growing pains. As sites, though, I think we can make a contribution if we just communicate and maybe make suggestions to our monitors or to our in-house monitor, because it's new to all of us. And we can share maybe better practices, or what works for a small site versus a big site. But I think just an open line of communication on how central monitoring is affecting the site, that particular site, they can just be open about it and say, I don't think, for my site, I would rather have one call a month. A call every 2 weeks is just too much for us, or can we communicate by email? So I think since this is something new and technology is also new and changing, and not all sites are open to it, they just need to communicate what their needs are and what their areas of difficulty are with the sponsors.
Yeah, I agree. I think communication is really key, because what one person finds to be really helpful, another person might find absolutely maddening, in terms of a way of reaching out, or how something is communicated overall. Email versus phone. Some people really prefer one over the other. If you have somebody who's at a small site, who's a nurse, they're with patients all day, and the phone is ringing off the hook, they might really prefer to just get an email when they can check it at the end of the day. So that communication piece, I think, is so important, and it has to be a back and forth learning between the central monitor or CRA and the site, and there has to be enough flexibility in the way we implement risk-based monitoring to allow for different situations and not make it a burden for the site.
I think we've identified a lot of the questions coming from the sites. Is there anything from your perspective, or are there some things that you could identify that you think are beneficial, that risk-based monitoring brings, that are beneficial to sites in how they conduct research today?
So I think from a sponsor perspective, it's really about providing the level of support needed. So not waste time. The vast majority, at least for us, of the sites that participate in our clinical trials, their main business is taking care of patients, and not necessarily working on these clinical trials. So you want to be careful of when you call them and when you go to the sites and take some of their time, that it is added value, that you have that you can have a constructive conversation with the sites and provide support, and not just spend time unnecessary.
Well, that certainly aligns. Yeah. Okay. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Sorry about that.
Jennifer. Go ahead, Jennifer.
I think it was Melissa, but Melissa, you can go ahead.
Okay.
I'll tag
on.
I
was just going to add, I'm in the U.S., so of course I only speak from my perspective, from what I know. But since we are global, other countries and cultures operate differently. So I think we need to take that into consideration also. And I think, as Jennifer said, one model does not fit all. And yes, it is important to be flexible, but sponsors and CROs won't know what is working and what is not working unless sites are verbal about that and share their experiences.
Absolutely.
I agree. And, there are definitely, some benefits to the site in terms of, at the end of the day, getting better visibility into their own data, hopefully. So, back in the old days of paper, data could just get filled out and sent in, and maybe they never really got that high-level look that is now available when we are able to put the data in real time into analytics and in real time provide that feedback. And my hope is really that the technology will advance to a place where sites will be able to log in if they want to. They shouldn't have it as an additional thing that they have to do, but if they have the opportunity and they want to be able to see their data at a high level and see what's going on at that level for their patients, that they should be able to do that just in the same way that that the other parties at the table are able to do that and provide that same level of oversight.
Absolutely agree.
And I think, again, focusing on, just subcategories of the questions that we've received thus far, I think you've covered most of the topics that, are within scope of this webinar. We talked about the functional roles and how they may vary across organizations. And we talked about the analytics and the technology being there. Is there something from the site and sponsor relationship when it comes to perhaps training or preparing the sites for implementation of RBN that might be different than what happens today? And what might that look like?
This is Marion. I think we've touched upon that slightly already, and I think it boils down to communication, right? Sites letting us know what they already know, or where things get difficult or they need more clarification. On the other hand, that applies to the sponsor and CRO companies as well. I think it's clarity in the communication. Are we sure that we are talking about the same thing? Are the definitions clear? Are the expectations clear? I think that would be, the starting point from everything, actually.
Okay, I really feel like most of the questions have really focused on that relationship across the team of researchers. And I do believe one of the other things we talked about, but again, I feel like you've touched on it, was what was your experience or perspective regarding the remote visits versus the traditional phone calls, and what the differences are and the value perceptions around these types of remote visits. I did hear you touch on this. And is the remote visit intended to replace those site phone calls? Again, maybe just to reiterate it, because it was a standalone question that came through a few times.
Well, this is Melissa. I would say the remote monitoring, which includes risk-based monitoring, which can be remote or on-site. The centralized monitoring is remote. But they all complement each other, and I think it enables the in-house monitor when they're the monitor on site to spend more time with the staff answering questions, because a lot of the work has already been done prior to her visit.
Right, I agree. I think that if we're doing it right, we're not only looking at risk and but we're also looking at workload and really being strategic and how we plan whatever we're calling the type of contact. Whether, from my perspective, it almost doesn't really matter if we're thinking of it as more of like a remote monitoring visit versus just a phone call, as long as it's clear what the drivers are, what the agenda would be, and that it makes sense in terms of the site schedule and what's going on at the site.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
All right.
Gloria?
Yeah. I was going to say we're just about at time, so thank you very much, everyone, for dialing in today. This session was recorded. I will be sending a link out in the next few days if you'd like to listen to the recording again, and I'll send that out to the folks that registered on the call today. So thank you very much for your attention and for dialing into TransCelerate's RBM webinar.